The sun baked the desert like an unforgiving furnace, casting long, shimmering mirages on the distant horizon. Each step burned, the cracked earth blistering the soles of Atsa's bare feet. Her arms trembled under the weight of her twin babies, swaddled tightly against her chest and back, their tiny bodies pressed close to hers for shade and warmth. One wailed weakly, the other was silent, too tired to cry. She didn't stop. Couldn't. Stopping meant death, and she had already seen enough of that. Atsa didn't look back at the trail behind her. There was nothing worth remembering there, only smoke, broken promises, and the still warm grave of her husband beneath a mound of red earth. They said it was an accident in the mine. That word, accident, rattled in her chest like dry corn husks. It wasn't an accident. Not when the men who ran the shaft had been warned about the cracks in the beams. Not when her husband, Halon, had told them. Not when he'd disappeared conveniently the day after confronting the foreman with land deeds he wasn't supposed to have. Her mouth was dry. Lips split. Each breath felt like dragging sand into her lungs. Still she walked. She had no horse, no wagon, no boots. Just her determination and a prayer whispered to the old gods under her breath, in the language of her grandmother. She had crossed 2 arroyos and an open canyon by sunrise. By noon, she spotted the faint outline of a town, a cluster of warped wood buildings leaning under the weight of the sun and their own exhaustion. Black Gulch. The town shimmered like a heat dream, its edges blurred by the dancing waves rising off the sand. As she stepped onto its splintered main road, everything slowed. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. One of the babies whimpered. Atsa didn't look left or right. She focused on the well in the center of town, like it was the mouth of salvation itself. She reached it, hands trembling, eyes swimming with dust and heat. She cranked the old pulley and the bucket rose, squealing. When the cool water touched her lips, she let out a low, broken sigh. The baby on her back stirred. The one at her chest latched weakly to her breast, trying to feed. From the porch of the sheriff's office, a man in a tan vest and wide-brimmed hat spat tobacco onto the planks. "Ain't got nothin' for ya here, squaw," he muttered loud enough for half the town to hear. She didn't flinch. Just dipped a cloth in the bucket and wiped her child's face. A woman behind the saloon curtain pulled her child inside. A shopkeeper closed his door and flipped the open sign. Atsa was used to being watched, but this was different. This was collective indifference sharpened into cruelty. She knew these faces, not them exactly but their kind. Faces that smiled at her husband's labor and scowled at his skin. She walked to the general store. A bell rang overhead as she stepped inside. The clerk looked up, froze, then slowly moved toward the counter like approaching something contagious. "Can't help you," he said flatly. "I just need milk. Bread maybe." "Anything," she said in soft, deliberate English. Her accent was thick, but her eyes were sharp. "You got money?" She hesitated. Then reached into her shawl, pulling out a small silver brooch, her mother's, carved with a Thunderbird symbol. The clerk glanced at it, sneered. "Don't take trade." He waved her off like she was a fly. She stood still for a long moment, then turned and walked out. Across the road, a slow creak echoed from a nearby porch. Boone Maddox sat in a wooden chair tilted back on 2 legs, a half-burned cigarette hanging from his lips. He didn't say a word. Just watched. Atsa saw him out of the corner of her eye, a tall man with grizzled features and gray at his temples, dust on his boots, and a silence that weighed heavier than a sermon. She tightened the cloth around her babies and walked on. Past the saloon, past the boarding house, past the church with its doors firmly shut. No one followed. No one offered water or shelter. Just Boone still watching from the shade. By dusk she was outside the town again. Her legs wobbled with every step. The babies stirred, one coughing with a dry rattle. She found a crevice by a cluster of rocks and curled up inside it. Dust settled on her skin like ash. The sky bled purple and orange as the sun dipped below the buttes. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Atsa closed her eyes and whispered a song, soft and rhythmic, the same lullaby her husband used to hum as he carved wood figures for the children. Somewhere in the night, a horse snorted. She opened her eyes to see Boone's silhouette against the fading light. He said nothing. Just stepped off his horse and knelt beside her. In his hand, a canteen. She stared at it. He didn't force it. Just held it out, eyes shaded by his hat. After a long moment she took it and drank. He watched her with a stillness that felt almost reverent. Then he handed her a bundle wrapped in linen, bread, jerky, and a soft cloth. "For the babies." She looked up, unsure whether to thank him or question him. He simply nodded once, then turned and walked back to his horse. "Why help?" she asked quietly. He paused, one boot in the stirrup. Then, with a voice like gravel and smoke, he replied, "Because someone should have helped sooner." Then he rode off into the dusk, and Atsa was left holding a gift she didn't understand and a hope she hadn't asked for. The next morning, the sun returned with its usual fury. Atsa resumed walking, this time with a slight limp. She followed the dried creek bed, heading west, unsure where the road would end, but feeling pulled toward it all the same. The twins were quiet, exhausted. Her hands ached from holding them. Her legs were blistered. Still, she moved forward, following the shape of the land the way her ancestors once followed stars. As the town disappeared behind her, a crow flew overhead, cawing sharply. Omen or not, she took it as a sign. Someone had seen her. By mid-morning, the trail curved between two sandstone ridges, where shade clung briefly to the canyon floor. She paused there, letting the babies rest, letting herself believe for just a moment that she might make it out of this alive. But the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of horses. Not Boone's. These were faster, heavier. Multiple hooves pounding across the flat. She froze. 3 riders crested the hill behind her, cutting through the heat shimmer like phantoms. Dust kicked up in their wake. Atsa crouched, shielding her children. One of the riders, a squat, pale man with a red bandana, called out to her. "Look who wandered off again. Thought we told you, girl, you don't leave without permission." She knew him. Tuck Bramble. Traitor. The would-be husband. He'd been sniffing around ever since Halone died, trying to force a marriage that would have given him claim to her land. Land she now carried proof of in a folded, sweat-stained paper hidden inside the lining of her shawl. She didn't speak. Tuck smiled like a wolf. "Ain't right you talking off with my property. And now the whole town saw you. Makes things complicated." She clutched the babies tighter. That's when the rifle cracked. The shot echoed through the canyon like a thunderclap. One of Tuck's men yelped, his hat flying off as the bullet grazed his ear. The horses reared. Tuck swore, spinning around. From the ridge above, Boone stood, rifle in hand, eyes cold. 3 seconds to ride away, he called down. Then I start aiming lower. Tuck's sneer twitched. "This ain't your fight, Maddox." Boone chambered another round. 3. The men hesitated. 2. Dust scattered. Hooves thundered. The riders turned tail and vanished over the ridge, curses trailing behind them. Atsa stared up at Boone, chest heaving. He descended the slope slowly, methodically. As he approached, she straightened, her fear replaced with a wary resolve. "You keep saving me," she said. Boone didn't smile. Just looked at the children. "They're worth saving." She didn't argue. He nodded toward the west. "Come on. Sun's rising hot. My place is a few hours out." She hesitated, looked at her children, then back at him. There was nothing but wind and dust behind her. In front, uncertainty, but at least not alone. She followed him. And behind them, the desert swallowed their footprints whole. The cabin sat low against the base of the mesa, its rough-hewn timbers weathered to a silvery gray. From a distance, it looked like it belonged to the earth itself, hunched and quiet like the man who lived inside. Boone Maddox dismounted without a word, his horse snorting as it pawed the dust. He held out a hand, not to her but to the bundle tied to her chest. Atsa flinched instinctively, but his eyes stayed level, calm, patient. "I'll carry him," he said simply, nodding to the baby slumped against her shoulder. She looked at him for a long moment, then unwound the sling. The baby stirred, giving a soft grunt. Boone took the infant carefully, holding him as though he might break. It didn't match his frame, broad-shouldered and worn from years of cattle work, but something about his touch was precise, almost reverent. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of cedar smoke and horses. It was sparse, a table with a few battered tin plates, a cot in the corner, and a rusted stove still warm from the morning's fire. Atsa stepped inside, unsure if she'd crossed into safety or a different kind of danger. Boone set the baby on a folded quilt and began rummaging in a small crate. He handed her a clean cloth, some bread and a jar of thick, cooled coffee. She ate slowly, cautiously, feeding the babies first, pausing between bites to study the man who'd brought her here. He moved with purpose, wordless and methodical. When he finally sat across from her, his eyes didn't search hers, they waited, giving her space. "You got names for 'em?" he asked quietly, tilting his head toward the children. She nodded. "Tali and Niall. Girl, boy." Her voice cracked but didn't break. Boone said nothing more for a while. The fire crackled in the stove, the only sound between them. Atsa finally broke the silence. "Why?" He looked at her. "Why what? Why'd you help me?" Boone leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, then picked up his cigarette from the edge of the stove where it had long gone cold. He didn't light it. Just turned it between his fingers like a worn coin. My wife died 6 years ago. Fever. Took the boy with her. I watched both of them burn up inside 3 days. And nobody, came. Atsa lowered her gaze. She said nothing, but in that silence, Boone saw the truth reflected in her face. They weren't the same, but they were both haunted by absence. I ain't a preacher. Don't got much sense for comfort, Boone added, voice gravel low. But I saw you walkin' through that town carryin' more than most men could shoulder. And I remembered what it felt like. To need help and get turned away. She glanced at the babies, now sleeping beside each other like curled fawns. People see brown skin and think savage. Boone didn't argue. They see what they're told to see. Night fell heavy outside the cabin, the wind howling softly against the planks. Atsa slept on the floor, wrapped in an old wool blanket. Boone sat at the table most of the night, carving the edge of a branch into a small figure, an old habit he hadn't done in years. By dawn, he'd shaped a little horse, simple and crude, but it reminded him of his son's hands reaching for toys he'd never grow into. The next few days passed like dust slipping through fingers. Atsa didn't say much, but she worked, sweeping the floor, washing linens, warming milk for the children. Boone repaired the fence around the paddock, occasionally glancing toward the window where the twins played on the quilt. There was something strange and quiet blooming between them, neither trust nor affection, but an understanding forged in shared loneliness. Then came the knock. It was mid-morning. Atsa was peeling dried apples near the stove, the children bundled in the sunlight. Boone's eyes cut to the door before the second knock came, harder this time. He motioned for Atsa to stay back. She stiffened but obeyed. Boone opened the door. Deputy Roy Cutter stood on the porch, sweat staining the collar of his shirt. Beside him stood a man with a scarred cheek and greasy blonde hair tucked under a black hat, Tuck Bramble. "Well now, ain't this neighborly," Tuck said with a grin that never touched his eyes. "Heard tell you got a visitor up here." Boone leaned against the doorframe. "I don't remember inviting anyone." Roy cleared his throat. "Now Boone, we just need to ask the lady a few questions. This man says she's mine," Tuck interrupted. "By arrangement." Her uncle agreed. "Her man's dead. Makes her mine by tribal custom, far as I understand it." Behind Boone, Atsa stepped into view. Her face gave nothing away. "She's got a voice. Let her speak it," Boone said evenly. Roy looked uncomfortable. "Don't want no trouble. But law says property disputes gotta be." "She ain't property," Boone said louder now. "You know that." Tuck stepped forward. "Listen, old man. You don't know who you're messin' with. She's got something that belongs to me and I aim to get it back." Atsa held her ground, eyes locked on Tuck. "You have nothing I want. I never agreed to anything. My uncle's word means less than the dirt under my feet." Tuck sneered. "You're a widow. No man, no land, no right." Boone's hand was resting on the doorframe, but his knuckles tightened. "You said what you came to say. Now get off my land." Roy shifted awkwardly, looking at Boone then at Tuck. "Let's go, Tuck." "This ain't finished," Tuck hissed. As they turned, Tuck spit onto the porch. Boone didn't flinch. He waited until their horses disappeared behind the ridge before shutting the door. Inside, Atsa stood still as stone. "They'll be back," she said quietly. Boone nodded. "I know." She reached into the lining of her shawl, pulling out a folded, worn paper. "This is what he wants." Boone took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a land claim, marked with a crooked seal and a forged signature. It granted Tuck access to mineral rights across Navajo territory, land never sold, never ceded. At the bottom was Halone's name, scratched faintly in ink, and below it, a smudge that looked like a blood thumbprint. "This yours?" Boone asked. "It was my husband's. He took it before they killed him. Said if something happened to him, I had to keep it hidden. He thought it might be enough to stop them." Boone stared at the paper for a long time. The fire crackled behind him. "You think Fort Windham'd honor this?" "It's a risk," Atsa said. "But it's truth. And I'm tired of hiding." He folded the paper again and tucked it into his coat. "Then we'll ride," he said. She blinked. "We." Boone looked at the children, then back at her. "You're not doing this alone." That night, Atsa sat on the porch while Boone cleaned his rifle inside. The wind was cooler now, curling around the cabin in soft sighs. She held Niall against her shoulder, feeling his breath against her collarbone. In the sky, the stars blinked into view one by one, ancient and unmoved. Somewhere out there, her husband's spirit wandered. Maybe he was watching. Maybe he was smiling. Behind her, Boone stepped outside, sat beside her on the step. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They sat in silence, a woman and a man bound not by love, not yet, but by a fragile thread of shared resolve. The road ahead would be hard. Dust and blood and fire. But for the first time since Halone's death, Atsa didn't feel entirely alone. And that made all the difference. Far down the ridge, the lights of Black Gulch twinkled in the dark, unaware that justice had begun to stir in the desert. Dawn broke like a fire over the horizon, spilling red light across the jagged edges of the mesas. Atsa strapped the babies to her back with a firm hand and an aching heart. The quilt Boone had wrapped around them was now rolled tightly in her satchel, along with a worn canteen and half a loaf of bread. Boone stood by the hitching post, securing the saddlebag with quiet precision. He'd already packed the rifle, 2 pistols, and the forged land claim tucked deep inside his coat pocket. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been carved into the silence between them. Boone handed her the reins to a small, sturdy roan mare. She's sure-footed. Keep your weight forward in the incline. Atsa nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. How far to Fort Windham? 3 days hard ride. 2 if we push. And if Tuck's already there? Boone adjusted his hat. Then we make noise loud enough to draw eyes. They set out as the sun rose higher, 2 riders and 2 sleeping children moving across a stretch of land vast and unforgiving. The terrain shifted from flat brush to broken stone, gullies that swallowed the path whole, and wind that howled like mourning spirits. The heat came fast and dry, baking sweat into skin and sand into the corners of the mouth. Boone rode slightly ahead, his frame upright and still, like he was carved from the same stone that surrounded them. Atsa followed close, scanning every ridge, every movement of bird or rabbit or dust trail. Trust came hard, but Boone hadn't broken it yet. They stopped only once to water the horses and share a strip of jerky. Boone knelt beside the babies, brushing Niall's cheek with a calloused finger. His tenderness wasn't something he flaunted, it came like a whisper, almost apologetic. Atsa caught herself watching him too long, searching for the crack in his silence. But none came. She mounted again without a word. By the time they made camp that night, the stars had burst through a curtain of black. Boone started a small fire, shielded from view by a cluster of rocks. Atsa warmed milk in a tin cup and fed the twins with slow, steady hands. They hadn't cried once all day, too tired or too trusting to wail. She wasn't sure which unnerved her more. Boone leaned against a stone, whittling again. Another horse. Slightly better than the first. He handed it to her without looking up. Your boy'll need something to hold when you ride into hell, he muttered. She took it, fingers brushing his for half a second. Her breath caught, then steadied. I never thank you. He gave a dry chuckle. Ain't looking for thanks. What are you looking for? Boone glanced at the fire, face flickering with the light. Redemption maybe. Or just a reason to keep getting up. Atsa lowered her gaze. Then we both got something to fight for. Sleep came in fragments as it always did. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind played cruel games with the fire's edges. Atsa sat awake for hours, one hand on her knife, the other cradling Niall. Boone took first watch, eyes scanning the darkness like a hawk. When he finally handed it over to her, he paused beside her for a moment, his voice low. If I don't come out of this, don't wait. Take that claim and get to Fort Windham. She met his gaze, unwavering. If you fall, I bury you proper. But you're not falling. He gave a slow nod and turned into the dark to find rest. The second day was crueler. Heat hit them like a wall by mid-morning, and the horses slowed under the weight. The babies whimpered in the shade of her shawl, and Atsa felt the sharp sting of fear beneath her ribs. Water was running low. Time even more so. By late afternoon, Boone spotted smoke on the western horizon, too small for a wildfire. A camp. They dismounted behind a sandstone bluff. Boone pulled out his spyglass, inspecting the distant figures. 4 riders. 1 wagon. And Tuck Bramble sitting smug at the fire, hat tipped low, revolver shining in the sun. Atsa crouched beside Boone, the babies nestled between them. Her face was tight with fury. They'll head out before dawn, she said. Boone nodded. Then we take the wagon. We don't have enough firepower. We don't need to fight. We need to slow 'em down. Boone took a coil of rope from his saddlebag, along with 2 small glass bottles filled with clear liquid. Turpentine and resin, he said. Used to be for stripping paint. Now it's for burning wheels. Atsa watched as he moved like a ghost down the ridge, circling wide. She wrapped the twins tighter, heart pounding, and muttered a prayer to the stars. An hour passed. Then two. And just as night settled, the flames erupted. The wagon caught fast and the horses panicked. Shouts filled the canyon. Tuck screamed something unintelligible, drawing his pistol and firing into the dark. Boone didn't return fire. He ran like a shadow, doubling back up the ridge where Atsa waited. "They'll waste time fixing the axle or tracking us," he said, breathless. "Either way, we get a head start." They rode through the night. By morning, the land opened into a wide basin, dry, cracked, and endless. Boone pointed to the faint shape in the distance. A flag on a pole. Walls of stone and timber. "Fort Windham," he said. Atsa's throat tightened. The end of the ride was near, but the beginning of the fight had just begun. They rode in slow, Boone at the lead, Atsa holding both reins and babies, shoulders squared despite the ache. Soldiers at the gate raised rifles, then lowered them with recognition. Boone dismounted and raised a hand. "Need to speak with Captain Sorrell." "Urgent." The guard squinted. "That so? Got a warrant or just good posture?" Boone didn't flinch. "Tell him it's Maddox. He'll understand." 15 minutes later, they were inside the commander's quarters. Captain Sorrell, gray-haired, lean, eyes sharp as flint, stood behind his desk with arms folded. "You're 2 days late, Boone." "And yet still right on time," Boone replied. He pulled the folded land claim from his coat and set it down on the desk. Sorrell raised an eyebrow. "Another forgery?" "No," Boone said. "It's the last one. The only real one. Witnessed by the tribal elder, sealed in blood, and stolen by Tuck Bramble after murdering a Navajo man." Sorrell opened the paper, reading carefully. His jaw clenched. "You're asking me to declare this a fraud, arrest Bramble, and undo a year's worth of dirty deals." "I'm asking you to honor truth," Boone said. Atsa stepped forward. "This land, my husband died for it. My children deserve better than lies. I rode here with my dead heart in my mouth. Don't make it for nothing." Sorrell looked between them, at the babies, at Boone, at the fire behind Atsa's eyes. He sighed. "This is going to raise hell." Boone smiled grimly. "Hell's already riding in. Might as well meet it upright." The captain nodded once. "I'll draw up the charges. But it won't be easy." Atsa straightened. "Easy died a long time ago." As they left the commander's office, Boone glanced down at her. "You all right?" "No," she said. "But I will be." They walked side by side, boots echoing on the stone, baby safe in her arms, justice just within reach. The fort walls rose around them like ancient guardians, and outside the wind shifted, like it too knew something was coming. Something fierce. Something righteous. Something long overdue. The wind howled across the parade ground, lifting dust into the noon air and dragging it into every open crease of the fort's wooden walls. Atsa stood by the barracks door watching a group of soldiers load rifles, their movements brisk and automatic. The babies were asleep inside under the watch of a young nurse, a girl barely old enough to hold a gun. Boone stood a few feet away, his hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the gate. Neither spoke. Words seemed too small for what loomed ahead. Tuck Bramble was coming. Of that, there was no doubt. Sorrell had sent a dispatch rider that morning with a warning message, hoping to stall him with a show of official orders. But Boone knew men like Tuck. They didn't read papers. They read fear. And when there was none, they brought their own. "They'll ride hard and dirty," Boone muttered, breaking the silence. "If he's desperate enough, he might not even stop at the gate." Atsa nodded slowly. Her hands clenched at her sides, the skin cracked from sun and ride. "He already thinks I'm his. Men like him don't take kindly to being denied." Boone looked at her, truly looked. Gone was the gaunt woman limping beneath a child's weight. The lines on her face were still sharp, but her spine had straightened, and her voice carried something new. Resolve. "You don't belong to anybody," he said firmly. She gave him a look that could have split granite. "I know that now." Sorrell stepped out from his office, his coat flapping in the wind. He joined them, glancing toward the hills beyond the fort's edge. Scouts spotted riders. 5, maybe 6. Half a mile out and pushing fast. Looks like Bramble didn't take kindly to being told no. Boone didn't blink. He never did. Sorrell adjusted his belt. "We'll meet him at the gate. I've posted guards. But if this turns into a firefight, I won't have civilians in the crosshairs." Atsa stepped forward. "Then put me on the wall. I'm no civilian." Boone started to object, but she cut him off with a glance. "I've buried a husband. Carried 2 babies across 3 counties. Watched men spit on my blood. I've got every right to stand. Sorel held her gaze, then gave a short nod. All right. But stay behind the barricade. You don't owe anyone your life, not even for justice. Boone handed her a rifle. It was clean, oiled, and heavy. She checked the chamber like she'd been doing it her whole life. Minutes later, they were all in position. Boone behind the central post, Sorel commanding from the tower, and Atsa crouched by a half-wall overlooking the gate. Below them, the dirt road twisted through the scrubland, and on it, the riders emerged like specters from a fevered dream. Tuck led the pack, dressed in black with silver buttons and a sneer already curling at the edge of his lips. His men flanked him, rough, filthy, some with coats stolen off the dead. Their horses pounded forward and no one pulled back. It wasn't a diplomatic visit. Sorel raised a hand. That's close enough. Tuck slowed, pulling his horse to a halt just outside rifle range. He shaded his eyes and squinted up at the wall. Well, Captain, I hear you've been meddlin' in matters above your rank. Sorel didn't blink. We have reason to believe you're in possession of stolen documents, forged signatures, and are complicit in the death of a Navajo man named Halone. Tuck laughed. It was sharp, mean, and hollow. That your case? A dead savage and a grieving squaw? Atsa's knuckles whitened around the rifle. Boone saw it and touched her arm gently. Not yet. Sorel stepped forward. You've got one chance to dismount and turn yourself in. Or this becomes a federal matter. Tuck leaned in his saddle. Ain't no matter to me. I came for what's mine. And I'm gettin' it. With that he raised his hand. Gunfire erupted. The first volley came from the outlaws, wild and undisciplined. Bullets whined past the walls, striking the wooden gate and sending splinters flying. Sorel shouted for cover. His men returned fire with practiced precision. One of Tuck's riders screamed and dropped from his horse. Boone took aim and fired once, clean straight through a man's shoulder. The outlaw toppled backward, his rifle skidding across the dust. Atsa stayed low, breathing hard. The sound of gunfire thundered in her chest, but her hands were steady. She waited, watched. Then she saw him, Tuck, weaving between his men, heading toward the left flank, trying to slip past the barrage. She raised the rifle, sighted him. Everything around her slowed. Tuck turned his head, just a fraction, and saw her. Their eyes locked. She fired. The shot grazed his side. He reeled back, swearing, clutching his ribs. Boone shouted her name, but she was already moving, ducking low, reloading. She had wounded him. It wasn't enough. But it had made him bleed. Boone saw the moment shift. Tuck panicking, his men scattering, 2 already down. Another bullet from the tower cracked the skull of a man reloading behind a fallen horse. Tuck grabbed the reins of a nearby mount and swung himself over. He turned and spat into the dust. You'll pay for this, Atsa. You'll wish you died out there on that road. Boone shouted, Stand down, Bramble. You're done. But Tuck bolted. He kicked his horse hard and galloped south, away from the fort, away from justice. Boone didn't hesitate. He vaulted from the wall, landed hard, and sprinted for his horse. Sorel's voice called after him. Maddox, let him run. But Boone was already in the saddle. Atsa looked down at the captain, then back at the babies wrapped in quilts inside the doorway. She turned to the soldier beside her. Watch them. And she ran. The chase burned across the plain. Boone pushed his horse, closing the distance with Tuck as sagebrush blurred past. Atsa followed close behind, the wind clawing at her braids. The land stretched out before them, open, wild, and unyielding. Tuck reached a dry creek bed and veered down sharply. Boone followed, rifle slung across his back, pistol in hand. Dust kicked high in the air, choking the breath from their lungs. Atsa came around the bend and saw them, 2 shadows cutting through a cloud of grit. Boone drew closer, close enough to see the raw panic on Tuck's face. The outlaw turned in the saddle and fired wildly. Boone ducked, felt the bullet graze his shoulder. He roared in pain but held steady. Then his horse faltered, stumbling on a rock. Boone pitched sideways and slammed into the dust. Atsa screamed his name. Tuck reared up, turned his horse and aimed his pistol at Boone. And then Atsa was there. She dismounted in a single leap, hit the ground running, and tackled Tuck from his saddle. They hit the creek bed with a crash, limbs flailing, the pistol skittering across the rocks. He was on top of her in an instant, snarling, eyes wide with rage. You little thief, he hissed. You don't get to walk away. She drove her knee into his ribs, rolled out from under him. He clawed for his pistol. She grabbed a rock. When he raised the gun, she brought the rock down hard. Once, twice. Then silence. Tuck lay still. Atsa knelt there, blood on her hands, breath shuddering. Boone limped over, clutching his shoulder. He looked at her, at the weapon in her hand, at the man on the ground. "You all right?" he rasped. She nodded barely. "I had to finish it," she whispered. He looked at Tuck's body, then at her again. "You did." Together they stood. The wind moved gently now, brushing their faces like a sigh from the land itself. Behind them the fort waited. Justice had not ridden out on paper. It had come in sweat and blood and fire. Boone touched her hand. She didn't pull away. The ride back would be long. The consequences would be many. But for the first time Atsa walked without weight on her back. Only purpose in her step. The dust settled slowly over the fort as twilight claimed the horizon. The gates stood open now, no longer a line of defense but a passage for returning souls. Atsa rode in first, her horse worn but steady beneath her. Boone followed close behind, his arm wrapped tight in a bloodied sling, his eyes never straying far from her silhouette. The sky above them burned orange, streaked with purple, a final, defiant gesture from the day that had nearly broken them. Inside the fort, soldiers emerged from barracks, eyes wide, posture tense. Captain Sorel met them near the stables, his expression taut, somewhere between relief and reprimand. But when he looked at Boone, disheveled, bleeding and resolute, he merely nodded. "It's done then?" he asked. Atsa slid off her horse. "It's done." Sorel looked at her, and for the first time, there was no doubt in his face, only respect. Behind her, Boone dismounted with a groan. He winced, but not from pain, more from the weight of everything that had passed. The ride back had been silent. Words felt too brittle, too slow for what they carried now. He glanced at Atsa and she met his gaze with something unspoken. Trust, maybe? Or a shared burden neither of them would ever fully shed. Inside the officers' quarters, the twins lay curled in woolen blankets, sleeping deeply. Atsa moved to them instinctively, kneeling beside the crib. She touched their foreheads, brushing away sweat and dust. Her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled. And finally she let herself cry. Not the silent tears she'd shed on the trail, nor the hot, furious ones she'd bitten back in towns that spat at her feet. These were different. They were heavy, but they didn't burn. They softened her. They released her. Boone stood at the doorway watching. He didn't interrupt. He just leaned against the frame, eyes fixed on the woman kneeling beside her children like she was anchoring herself to the world. "You've done more than most ever would," he said gently. "More than anyone had the right to expect." She didn't respond at first. When she did, her voice was quiet. "He said I'd wish I died on that road. But you didn't." "No," she whispered. "I lived." Boone walked over, crouched beside her. His injured arm stayed pressed against his side, but his presence felt steady, grounding. "You think they'll come looking?" she asked. Tuck had a reputation. But he rode alone at the end. His kind usually dies alone too. There might be whispers. But no one's going to ride into this fort asking questions. She looked at him, eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I'm not afraid." "I know." They sat in silence for a moment, the room around them dimming with the sun. Somewhere outside, a bugle called the evening watch. The fort breathed again, its heartbeat returning to normal. Sorel joined them not long after. He came bearing papers, official forms, declarations, all neatly penned and ready to be filed. Boone stood to take them but stopped when he saw Atsa rise instead. "I'll sign," she said. "Not for your records. For mine." She pressed the ink to her thumb and marked the page. Her name, her claim, her truth, documented in a language that had never been hers, but now bore the weight of her justice. Sorel watched her with a tired smile. "You ever think of staying?" She looked out the window. The plains stretched far, endless and wild. "This place kept me alive. But I wasn't born behind walls." "You've earned the right to choose," Sorel said. "I already have," she replied. Boone followed her outside. The night was cool, stars beginning to break through the clouds. Fires lit in small circles across the fort yard, cooking pots bubbling, laughter rising from the weary soldiers who had stared death in the eye and lived to eat again. They walked in silence toward the stables. Her horse was fed, watered, and already packed. She moved like she had done it 100 times before. Boone stopped beside her, uncertain. "You're really going?" She nodded, cinching a strap tight. "I need to go back. Not to hide. To begin again. Among my people. Among land that knows me." Boone's jaw tightened. "You don't have to ride alone." She turned, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. "I've never really been alone, Boone." "Not with them," she nodded toward the building, And not with you. He looked down at his boots. I'm not good at saying things that matter. But I. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth between them. You said them. When it counted. Their hands brushed. The moment hung, suspended like the stars above them. Then she pulled away gently. I'll never forget what you did, she said. He smiled, a sad kind of proud. You didn't need saving, Atsa. You just needed space to fight back. She mounted the horse. The babies slept peacefully in the satchels, rocked by the rhythm of her heartbeat. As she rode toward the gate, the fort behind her dimmed into shadow. The stars above sharpened. And somewhere between the silence and the wind, a new chapter whispered open. Boone stood at the gate long after she vanished into the darkness. He knew better than to chase what wasn't meant to be claimed. He also knew she'd carry his name in her story, not as a hero, but as someone who stood beside her when the world turned cruel. Back in the fort, life moved forward. Sorel filed the papers. The soldiers cleaned their rifles. The dust eventually settled. But the tale spread faster than wildfire across the frontier. Of the Navajo woman who walked barefoot under the sun, carrying twin babies across a pitiless land. Who stood down a killer. Who bled for truth and earned her name not through silence but survival. Some said she was a ghost, others a spirit sent by the earth to remind men of their cruelty. But Boone knew better. He'd seen her cry. He'd seen her bleed. He'd seen her rise. And in a place that often forgot the names of the women it trampled, hers remained. Atsa. Which meant eagle. And like the eagle she had soared, bloody, unbroken, and above it all. As dawn cracked the horizon, Boone turned from the gate and walked back into the fort. Not with sorrow. But with the quiet knowing that something true had passed through his life. And left it changed forever.